Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a place where your breath fogs the air and your fingers cling to the last scraps of warmth. A medieval castle in the dead of winter. The fire in the great hall crackles, but the corridors still feel like stone refrigerators, and the wind whistles through arrow slits as if mocking your thin cloak. You probably won't survive this, not without a pantry stacked higher than your head and a good sense of humor about eating the same dish day after day. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening somewhere chilly, drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where you're braving your own frosty nights. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the icy courtyard, boots crunching over patches of snow that never fully melt in the shade of the castle walls. The fields beyond are empty, nothing but frozen mud and the skeletal stubs of last year's crops. There's no wheat waving in the breeze, no cheerful orchard bursting with apples. The land is asleep, and you realize that whatever food sustains the people inside must have been stored months ago, harvested and hidden before the first frost. You can almost hear the Lord Steward scolding the workers back in autumn. Fill the granary now, or we'll be chewing our boots by February. The stone walls keep out raiders, but they also keep in the chill. You tug your cloak tighter and smell smoke drifting from chimneys, a reminder that fuel, like food, must be carefully rationed. Fires roar in the great hall where nobles dine, but the servants and soldiers tucked in drafty chambers huddle over smaller flames, sharing heat like gossip. A mainstream historical fact here. Castles weren't heated evenly. The main chamber glowed with firelight, while most other rooms were so cold you could see your breath indoors. People literally slept in fur-lined caps and mittens just to keep their fingers from stiffening overnight. As you wander the kitchen corridors, the emptiness of the landscape outside presses against the walls. The fields that fed everyone are barren, which means that survival depends on what was gathered in better months. In summer, peasants brought in carts of grain, baskets of onions, barrels of cider, all funneled into the Lord's stores. Now, those supplies are locked behind heavy wooden doors, guarded as carefully as gold. Food is wealth. Food is power. Food is life. A curious tidbit you wouldn't expect. Some castles employed watchers of bread to ensure no one pinched a loaf from storage. Yes, imagine your entire job being to sit in a cellar and glare at bread like it might misbehave. The harsh reality becomes clear. Winter inside a castle isn't some fairy tale banquet every night. Sure, you might picture roaring feasts with swan on silver platters, but that's festival food. Most days are ordinary, monotonous, practical. You'll chew bread that hardens by the hour, slurp stews thickened with whatever's still edible, and maybe gnaw on salted meat that tastes more like brine than beef. Historians still argue whether ordinary garrisons ate better than nearby villagers, or whether the glamour of castle life was mostly reserved for nobles at the high table. The debate lingers because surviving winter meant strict rationing, and no one wrote love letters to their daily bowl of pottage. You pause in the drafty hallway and run a finger along the icy stone. The idea of running out haunts the castle. If the Lord's steward miscalculated, if mice got into the grain, if salted barrels leaked, if raiding parties burned nearby fields, people inside might go hungry long before spring. Famine wasn't just something that happened out there in peasant huts. Even inside thick walls, bellies could ache. One season of poor harvest could ripple into a winter of scraping plates clean and pretending you weren't still hungry. That's the quiet tension you feel now, not the clash of swords, but the whisper of empty cupboards. The garrison soldiers sharpen blades, but they're just as concerned about tomorrow's ration. Kitchen servants plan meals like mathematicians, stretching grain sacks into weeks, then months. And nobles, despite their privileges, eye the storerooms with the same nervous calculation. After all, rank doesn't taste like roasted goose if there's no goose left to roast. A joke floats into your head as you notice a barrel labeled with chalk. Maybe in medieval times, labeling wasn't about gluten-free or vegan, but more like, don't touch this unless you want the Lord screaming at you. It's oddly relatable. Pantry politics never really went out of style. So here you are, wandering the castle's frigid belly, surrounded by stone walls that trap more cold than warmth, knowing that every bite from here on is borrowed from autumn's harvest. The emptiness of the countryside is pressing on the gates, reminding everyone that survival depends on what's locked inside. And as the long winter night deepens, you sense that the real story of castle dining isn't about feasts, but about endurance. You shuffle down a staircase that twists like a stone corkscrew, the air growing damper with each step. The smell hits you first, sharp salt, acrid smoke, and the faint sweetness of decay. Welcome to the cellar, the true beating heart of the castle in winter. Up above, people dream of roasted boar and warm bread. Down here, survival smells like brine, ash, and a faint mildew that clings to your cloak no matter how fast you move. Your torch flickers against rows of barrels, some banded with iron, others patched and leaking. Inside them rests meat preserved in salt so thick it could double as armor plating. Imagine biting into bacon that's been marinating for 6 months. It's salty enough to wake the dead, but it won't kill you. That's the deal. Taste suffers, but your stomach doesn't rebel. The medieval cook's first weapon against winter hunger was salt, dragged from coastal flats or mined from deep earth, sometimes worth as much as coins. It kept pork, beef, and fish from rotting, letting you chew something vaguely edible when the outside world was frozen solid. You pass a row of smoked fish hanging like shriveled lanterns. Their skin gleams with tarry blackness from weeks suspended above smoldering fires. Smoked herring, smoked eel, smoked everything. If you could hang it in a smoky room, chances are it ended up on a wooden plate by February. Here's your mainstream fact for tonight. Smoked herring was such a staple that entire towns specialized in it, shipping barrels inland where castles like this relied on them. The smell of fish clung to walls for months, meaning even if you hated it, there was no escape. A quirky tidbit? Well, archaeologists have found entire frog skeletons inside castle latrines, which suggests two possibilities. Either people were eating frogs as a cheap snack, and the bones slipped through their digestive systems, or the frogs just fell in and, well, didn't make it out. Either way, it adds some unexpected protein to the medieval winter menu. You crouch by a barrel, trailing your fingers through crystalline salt around a chunk of pork. It's more rock than meat now, but cooks knew how to soften it. Soak it overnight, boil it until the brine bled out, then smother it in onions or herbs if you had any left. Salt pork was to medieval castles what instant ramen is to broke students. A little disgusting after the 20th serving, but a lifeline you can't argue with. Historians still argue whether cellars were actually well-organized or chaotic pits of half-rotten food. Some records describe meticulous inventories with every barrel counted, sealed, and signed by the steward. Others suggest rats feasted as freely as people did, scurrying through half-smashed casks while servants shrugged. Truth is probably somewhere in between. Some castles prided themselves on spotless stores, while others smelled more like the inside of a compost heap. You run a hand along the smoke-darkened beams overhead and realize that the cellar wasn't just food storage. It was anxiety made physical. Each barrel was a countdown. Every fish you pulled down was one less meal between you and starvation. And no matter how careful the rationing, people always eyed the supplies with suspicion. Will this stretch until spring? Will it mold? Will someone sneak in at night and shave off a slice? There's a joke waiting here, of course. When your lord tells you to guard the salt beef with your life, you wonder whether he means from raiders or from his own hungry children sneaking bites after curfew. You imagine the daily routine, the cook sending boys down to fetch hunks of meat, hacking through crusted salt with knives that ring like chisels, dragging up slabs of flesh that look more like fossil than food. In the kitchen above, they'd stew it with grain, or maybe serve it with mustard if they were lucky. On feast days, the smoked fish came out, filling the hall with a haze that made even nobles smell like campfires. What's striking is how little variety winter allowed. Autumn cellars might burst with apples, pears, or carrots, but by midwinter, much of that was gone or shriveled. What remained, salted, smoked, dried, defined the diet. And though you might long for something fresh and crisp, you learned to make peace with monotony. Because while the castle walls kept enemies out, they also locked you in, with nothing but your barrels, your smoke, and the lingering salt tang on your tongue. The torch sputters as you climb back toward the hall, leaving behind the silent guardians of survival. The cellars may not be glamorous, but without them, the castle would have been nothing more than a stone tomb waiting for spring. You rub your hands together as you leave the dank cellar, only to discover that the main course for most people isn't meat at all. It's grain. Boring, predictable, dependable grain. Wheat if you're lucky. Barley and rye if you're not. Oats if you're somewhere in between. Grain was the skeleton key of medieval diets, and inside these stone walls it showed up in nearly every bowl and on every plate. Bread, porridge, pottage, ale, different disguises for the same humble seed. You realize quickly, in winter, grain is your best friend, your worst enemy, and sometimes both at once. A servant passes you carrying a tray of dark, heavy loaves. Forget fluffy sourdoughs with crunchy crusts. These breads are dense, closer to bricks than baguettes. They're baked in communal ovens, sometimes once every week or two, and stored to harden over days. If your teeth are sharp, you gnaw through the crust. If not, you dunk it in stew to soften the blow. Here's the mainstream fact. Bread was the single most important food in medieval Europe, often making up 50 to 70% of daily calories. Take away bread and a castle garrison might collapse faster than its walls in a siege. But bread wasn't just bread, it was a class marker. Nobles nibbled on fine white loaves made from sifted wheat, while soldiers and servants chewed dark rye or barley loaves so fibrous they could double as scouring pads. Peasants outside the walls often ate something even rougher, maslin bread, a grim mixture of whatever grains they could scavenge. And in harsh winters, when wheat ran short, even lords sometimes had to lower themselves to darker loaves. Imagine a duke sulking over rye bread, muttering, "What am I, a shepherd?" Now you peer into a pot bubbling over a smoky fire. Inside is the true star of the medieval winter menu, pottage. This humble stew begins with water and grain, then welcomes whatever vegetables, herbs, or meats happen to be available. In winter, that usually means leeks, onions, maybe dried beans, and a sprinkle of bacon fat if fortune smiles. Every spoonful tastes slightly different depending on what was thrown in. but the base is always the same, gruel-like, filling, and far less exciting than its smell might promise. You sip, and it coats your tongue with warmth, but also with that vague school cafeteria mystery texture. The quirky tidbit? Some castles added stale bread straight into the pot to thicken pottage until it resembled paste. Imagine calling that innovation. And yet, it worked. Nobody starved, and nobody complained too loudly, because complaining didn't make the pot any richer. Historians still argue whether winter diets in castles were monotonous drudgery or surprisingly varied. Some records suggest that even in harsh months, garrisons had access to peas, beans, dried herbs, and the occasional rabbit snared near the walls. Others insist the daily grind was exactly that: grain, grain, and more grain, with flavor as rare as sunshine in January. Without detailed menus, the truth remains slippery. But if you're the one chewing this loaf, you'd bet on monotony. You tear off a hunk of bread and dunk it into the pottage. The crust softens, the stew thickens, and suddenly it's almost pleasant. There's a rhythm to it. Bread, stew, swallow, repeat. You can imagine entire winter nights passing like this, punctuated by the clatter of spoons and the occasional grunt of approval. Comfort food, medieval style. But grain wasn't just eaten. It was hoarded, feared, and guarded. Granaries were locked tighter than treasure chests, and for good reason. Spoiled wheat could breed ergot fungus, which caused hallucinations, convulsions, even death. People didn't know the science, but they knew the symptoms. Whole villages sometimes danced, twitched, or collapsed under its grip, later remembered as curses or saints' punishments. Joke's on you if your winter stew comes with a side of psychedelic bread. Suddenly, even the blandest loaf seems like a blessing. You glance at a small, flat cake cooling by the fire, made from oats pressed into rough patties. They're portable, cheap, and hard as roofing tiles once they cool, but they slip into saddlebags easily. Soldiers on patrol often carry them, gnawing on them like granola bars minus the chocolate drizzle. Think of them as medieval power bars, except instead of boosting your gym routine, they just keep you from collapsing on icy walls. Another joke sneaks into your mind. If you offered a knight a choice between a shining sword and a warm loaf of bread in February, don't be surprised if he lunges for the loaf first. So here's your truth. Meat may fill the imagination, but grain fills the stomach. And as the castle settles into another long night, the people inside aren't feasting like kings. They're chewing bread that could chip a tooth, swallowing pottage thick as cement, and thanking the heavens for every last crumb. Because in this season, you don't dream of banquets. You dream of warm, soft bread that doesn't exist, at least not until the thaw. You move deeper into the kitchens, where the air shifts from smoky to sour, a tang that curls around your nose and reminds you of cheese shops you've strolled past centuries later. Here, in the dark recesses of the castle, dairy rules, not fresh milk. It's spoiled within hours without refrigeration, but its transformed cousins, cheese, butter, and the ever-present sour milk that somehow refused to die. You realize quickly that cows, goats, and sheep weren't just four-legged lawnmowers. They were survival machines whose milk could be stretched into food that lasted long after the pastures froze. You pass by wheels of cheese stacked like giant coins along a damp wall. Some are soft and oozing, others hard enough to dent a dagger. Mainstream fact time. Medieval cheese wasn't the delicate brie or sharp cheddar you imagine today. It was functional, designed to last through months of storage, often salted heavily and hardened until it could be shaved into stews or grated over bread. These wheels could survive journeys in carts, even sieges, which made them as valuable as sacks of grain. And yes, nobles loved cheese, but so did garrisons. It was one of the few foods that crossed class boundaries. A servant cuts a wedge from a wheel and hands it to you. It tastes sharp, crumbly, and just a little funky. You chew slowly, imagining a diet where this was your closest thing to dessert. Still, after weeks of salty pork and gritty bread, even funky cheese feels like a gift. The quirky tidbit? Monks often became expert cheese makers, tinkering with curds and rinds like early scientists. Some abbeys guarded their recipes like state secrets, which is why modern cheeses like Parmesan trace their ancestry back to cloistered kitchens rather than royal feasts. Picture a monk muttering vows of silence while also inventing your favorite pizza topping. Now that's multitasking. But cheese wasn't the only player. You spot a churn in the corner, its wooden dasher worn smooth. Butter was a winter staple, though its presence depended heavily on geography. In northern castles, butter was common, spread on bread or melted into porridges. In southern Europe, olive oil sometimes replaced it, though oil had to be imported at great expense. Here in your castle, butter reigns. It's golden, fatty, comforting, something you can smear on coarse bread to trick your tongue into thinking you're feasting. And then there's sour milk. Today you'd call it spoiled and throw it away, but back then, it was a kind of reluctant cousin to yogurt. Leftover milk turned tangy, curdled, and drinkable in a pinch. People actually liked it, or at least convinced themselves they did. It was hydrating, nourishing, and sometimes mixed into porridges to soften the grain. Historians still argue whether sour milk was consumed by choice or sheer necessity. Was it a rustic delicacy, or just an better than nothing solution when fresh milk was impossible? The records leave room for both answers, depending on how desperate the winter grew. The cooks up here get clever. They grate hard cheese into bubbling pottage, whisk butter into sauces, or melted over dried fish to mask the briny tang. Butter, cheese, and sour milk stretch flavor across otherwise bleak meals, layering fat and richness onto what might otherwise be bowls of hot sadness. And fat mattered. A lot. In a world where calories were survival, butter was basically energy you could smear on bread. Forget protein shakes. A medieval knight might power his patrol with a few chunks of cheese and a thick slice of buttered rye. Of course, there's always a little humor tucked into these cold halls. Imagine being a kitchen boy told to churn butter for an hour straight in a freezing chamber. No Spotify, no TikTok. Just sploosh, sploosh, sploosh. It's medieval cardio, and all you get at the end is a pat of butter the Lord might devour in 2 bites. Talk about unfair wages. You glance at a clay jug of curds and whey, realizing that Little Miss Muffet wasn't just a nursery rhyme. It was a description of someone eating dairy scraps, because that's what there was. And though the rhyme sounds whimsical, the reality was simple. When you live in a castle in January, you eat what you can, not what you want. So you bite another piece of sharp cheese, wash it down with tangy milk, and scrape butter across stale bread. It's not glamorous, but it fills your belly and keeps you trudging forward. Because in these walls, dairy isn't a side dish. It's a lifeline, wrapped in rind and churned with effort, waiting in the cold for the moment you need it most. You step into another chamber where the air smells less like food and more like a pub. Wooden casks line the walls, hoops creaking slightly as the liquid inside shifts with the cold. This is where thirst is tamed, though not in the way you expect. Water? Forget it. Clear, pure, reliable water is a modern luxury. In the castle, water could be muddy, contaminated, or, if fetched from a moat, downright lethal. So you, like everyone else, turn to ale and wine. A servant hands you a wooden cup filled with ale that looks more like murky soup than golden lager. You sip and taste something earthy, yeasty, a little sour. But here's the mainstream fact. Medieval ale wasn't about getting tipsy. It was about staying alive. Brewed without hops until later centuries, it was mild in alcohol, often weaker than modern beer, and drunk by everyone. Lords, ladies, children, even monks. Alcohol killed off harmful bacteria, making ale safer than water. A toddler with a sippy cup of ale sounds bizarre, but in this world, it was common sense. Now, wine. Wine was different. Nobles craved it, sometimes importing barrels from vineyards hundreds of miles away. In northern castles, where grapes refused to grow, wine was a luxury, transported at great cost and reserved for high tables. Red, white, spiced, it varied, but it was always a status drink. You picture a lord swirling his goblet with theatrical flair while his soldiers sip thin ale in the corner. The quirky tidbit here? Sometimes people heated wine with spices and honey, creating a mulled concoction called hippocras. It was served at feasts as a show of wealth, like saying, "Yes, I boiled this imported luxury on purpose." Historians still argue whether castle water supplies were truly deadly or just unappetizing. Some castles had clever cistern systems collecting rainwater. Others had wells dug deep into clean aquifers. In those cases, water might have been perfectly safe, but written accounts show people distrusted plain water, often calling it unhealthy or weak. Whether this was superstition or sound science remains a debate, but either way, if you're parched in this hall, you're more likely to grab a cup of ale than a ladle of water. You notice another detail. Ale didn't last long. Brewed in small batches, it soured within days, so castle brewers worked constantly, stirring kettles and feeding fires. The smell of malted barley drifting through the courtyard was as normal as the clang of armor. Beer wasn't just drink, it was infrastructure. And then there were the experiments. Meads from honey, ciders from apples, even perry from pears. These weren't as universal as ale, but popped up where local supplies allowed. Mead, in particular, carried a reputation of romance and indulgence. Picture some poor knight sighing into his horn of honey wine, pretending he was in a ballad instead of a drafty corridor. Joke time. Imagine trying to explain to a medieval brewer the concept of craft beer flights. He'd squint at you, hand you 3 mugs of the same cloudy ale and say, "They're a flight. Now go clean the mash tun." What strikes you most is the constant hum of drinking. Ale wasn't for parties, it was for breakfast. Wine wasn't rare. It was rationed carefully, yes, but always hovering at the edge of the noble diet. And in the dead of winter, when warmth was scarce, a spiced wine or hearty ale wasn't just hydration. It was comfort, morale, even medicine. Doctors of the time prescribed wine for digestion, ale for strength, mead for melancholy. Was it effective? Maybe not, but at least it kept you hydrated without poisoning yourself on stagnant moat water. You drain your cup, wipe the foam from your lip, and glance at the casks again. Each one is another countdown, just like the meat barrels in the cellar. When the ale runs out, nerves fray. When the wine runs dry, feasts lose their sparkle. The castle doesn't just eat its way through winter, it drinks through it too. And as you stagger slightly from your 3rd mug of very mild ale, you realize that hydration here is always a little fuzzy around the edges. You wake the next morning with a slightly fuzzy head. Too many mugs of weak ale, perhaps. and shuffle back toward the kitchens. The air here carries a sweeter fragrance than before. It's not the tang of cheese or the brine of meat. It's something rarer, something precious, spices, honey, and those little luxuries that make winter bearable. For all the monotony of salted pork and heavy bread, a dash of pepper or a spoonful of honey could transform a meal into a memory. You pause near a table where the cook sprinkles something black and sharp over a steaming pot. Pepper. Imported across seas, caravans, and bandit-infested passes, it cost its weight in silver, yet it appeared in many noble kitchens. Mainstream fact: pepper was the most traded spice in medieval Europe, so valuable it even served as rent or bribes. A lord might pay mercenaries with coins one day and with peppercorns the next. To your winter-weary tongue, those tiny black flecks are a miracle, spice that jolts your stew awake. Then comes cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, rare, exotic, and far too expensive for soldiers or peasants. Nobles adored them not just for flavor, but for bragging rights. A pinch of cinnamon in wine wasn't just taste. It was theater. Proof that your castle's coffers reached all the way to Indian Ocean trade routes. And because scarcity breeds exaggeration, recipes sometimes demanded ridiculous amounts. Imagine stewing beef with a handful of cloves and thinking, yes, this will prove my superiority. Quirky tidbit. Some medieval cookbooks even suggested adding sugar and cinnamon to fish. Sweet sushi avant la lettre? Or just a desperate attempt to mask the flavor of 6-month-old cod? You decide. But honey, that was a different story. Unlike exotic spices, honey came from local hives, though still guarded like treasure. Refined sugar barely existed in Europe until later centuries, so honey was the main sweetener for everything: sauces, pastries, spiced wine. Its golden stickiness could elevate porridge from punishment to pleasure. In fact, honey was so prized that monasteries often kept entire apiaries, not for romance or mead-making alone, but for steady supplies of sweetness through the bitter months. Historians still argue whether honey was used daily by common folk or hoarded for special occasions. Some records suggest garrisons sweetened their ale. Others insist honey was locked away for feasts only. The cook dips a spoon into a jar and drizzles honey over cheese, handing it to you as though it were dessert. You taste it, and for a moment the walls, the drafts, the endless salted meat all fade behind that fleeting sweetness. You understand instantly why people risked bee stings and braved winter hives. A single spoonful could change morale. Luxuries weren't just about food, though. They were psychological armor. When the snow piled high and nights stretched endlessly, a lord could rally his table with a spiced wine or sweetened pie. It reminded everyone that life wasn't only survival, that winter could hold flashes of indulgence. Soldiers might gnaw barley bread in the barracks, but if the noble family feasted upstairs with cloves, honey, and almond paste, the entire castle felt reassured. Resources still flowed, trade still worked, hope still existed. You smirk as another thought pops into your head. Imagine being a medieval cook, asked to season stew for 200 people with exactly 3 peppercorns. It's like sprinkling half a packet of ketchup across an entire high school cafeteria pizza. Culinary optimism at its finest. Still, the small luxuries mattered. They broke monotony, sparked joy, and hinted at a wider world beyond frozen fields. Each spice jar whispered of caravans crossing deserts, ships braving storms, merchants haggling in far-off ports. Every spoonful of honey connected you to buzzing summer meadows now buried under snow. In the heart of a castle winter, these luxuries weren't frivolous. They were reminders that seasons change, that sweetness exists, that the world is bigger than stone walls and salted pork. So you savor your honeyed cheese, lick the last trace from your fingers, and breathe in the faint perfume of pepper and cinnamon. It's fleeting, yes, but that's the magic of luxuries. They make the ordinary feel extraordinary, even if only for a moment. You wipe the honey from your lips and step into the great hall just as the long trestle tables are being set. Here, the contrast between classes stretches wider than the moat outside. On one side, peasants and servants scrape bowls of pottage, chew stale rye, and gnaw onions like they're apples. On the other, nobles prepare for a winter feast, laying out gilded platters, knives polished to mirrors, and goblets waiting for wine spiced with cloves. You suddenly realize eating in a castle isn't one story, it's 2. Let's start with the peasants' forage. Even in the dead of winter, they didn't just sit back and starve. Out in frozen fields, they dug up root vegetables stored in pits: turnips, parsnips, carrots, onions. These humble roots were winter's secret stash, buried under straw or packed in earth to keep from freezing solid. Mainstream fact: root cellaring was the medieval refrigerator, and it allowed families to stretch their harvest months longer. Without it, even the hardiest peasant meals would vanish by January. Foraging mattered too. Peasants searched hedgerows for nuts forgotten by squirrels, gathered winter herbs like thyme or sage, even stripped bark to grind into rough flour when grain ran short. Yes, bark bread, chewy, bitter, and about as satisfying as gnawing on your dining table, but enough to keep people alive. You laugh to yourself, because in the world of trendy paleo diets, bark bread would probably sell for $12 a slice with a hipster label. Meanwhile, nobles feasted upstairs. Imagine swan roasted with sauces thickened by almonds, peacocks redressed in their feathers for dramatic flair, and pies filled with venison spiced with pepper. Banquets weren't everyday affairs, but when they happened, they glittered like a beacon in the long winter gloom. The quirky tidbit? Some feasts included subtleties, elaborate sugar sculptures shaped into castles, saints, or mythical beasts. They weren't meant to be eaten so much as admired. Think of them as medieval Instagram posts. But instead of likes, you got gasps from your guests. Historians still argue whether ordinary garrison soldiers benefited much from noble feasts. Did scraps trickle down after the banquet? Or did nobles guard the good stuff jealously? Some records suggest soldiers got bones and leftovers. Others imply the divide was harsher, with common folk sticking to their gruel regardless of festivities upstairs. The truth likely varied by castle, but the tension between plain bowls and gilded platters was always there. You watch as the steward carries in trenchers, flat rounds of stale bread used as plates. Nobles pile them high with roasted meat, sauces, and pies. Afterward, the soaked trenchers are given away to the poor or the dogs, depending on the lord's mood. Imagine being a peasant, and your greatest luxury is nibbling someone else's gravy-soaked plate. A little sad, a little practical, and weirdly efficient. No dishwashing required. At the far end of the hall, the peasant's fare continues quietly. Pottage, black bread, onions, maybe a bit of dried beans if the stores allow. The smell of venison stew drifts over, tantalizing but untouchable. You realize it's not just a meal. It's a reminder of hierarchy, of who owns the storerooms and who licks the spoons. You chuckle when you picture a medieval peasant sneaking a noble's roasted goose leg under his cloak, only to be caught mid-bite and sentenced to muck out the latrines for a month. That's one way to learn table manners. Still, the divide isn't just about hunger. It's about morale. Feasts upstairs reassure guests that the Lord is powerful enough to feed lavishly, even in winter. For peasants, even the smell of roasted swan drifting down the stairwell might signal stability. If the Lord is thriving, maybe the castle won't fall. And yet, the quiet scraping of spoons in the servants' corner reminds you that survival for most was a matter of turnips, onions, and broth, not jeweled goblets and peacock feathers. So you sit halfway down the hall, torn between envy and sympathy. You sip a thin ale, watch nobles laugh with greasy fingers, and glance at peasants chewing their onions. Two worlds in one hall, separated not by stone, but by bread crusts, spices, and the cruel arithmetic of winter rations. You linger in the hall as the laughter from the nobles fades, replaced by the solemn toll of a bell. Tonight, isn't a feast, it's a fast. The church calendar, as rigid as the castle walls, dictates what you can and cannot eat. Winter meals aren't just shaped by storage and scarcity. They're shaped by faith. You quickly realize your stomach doesn't answer only to hunger. It answers to holy days. The steward announces the rules, and everyone nods. No meat today. Instead, fish, eggs, if permitted, vegetables, bread, ale. The rhythm of food bends around Lent, Advent, Fridays, Ember Days. Sometimes over half the year carries restrictions of one kind or another. Mainstream fact. In medieval Europe, the church required fasting from meat on Fridays and during Lent, with exceptions only for the sick, the young, or those granted special dispensations. The castle kitchens had to keep track of these dates as carefully as they did the grain supply. You wander into the kitchen where cooks grumble as they rearrange menus. No pork stew tonight. Instead, dried fish from the cellar is soaking in water. Onions simmer beside it, and bread waits in baskets. You watch a boy carrying eels in a bucket, slimy, wriggling, and destined for someone's plate. The quirky tidbit? Eels were considered a fasting-friendly fish, and so popular that monasteries sometimes built elaborate eel ponds to keep them handy. Imagine explaining to your modern grocery clerk that you need 50 live eels for Lent. The rules weren't just about fish versus meat. Fasting often meant smaller portions, no dairy, and no luxuries. But humans being humans, they found loopholes. Beavers, for example, were classified as fish by some churchmen because their tails were scaly. Historians still argue whether people sincerely believed this or just exploited technicalities to sneak more protein onto their plates. Either way, roasted beaver tail occasionally made an appearance during supposed fasting meals. Faith is firm, but appetite is creative. You sit at the servants' table, chewing bread and sipping ale, listening to whispers about tomorrow's feast day. The contrast between fast and feast created rhythm in castle life. A week of plain fare made roasted goose taste divine. And while peasants might grumble about fasting rules, it also gave them moments of solidarity. Everyone, rich and poor alike, adjusting their diets together. In some castles, nobles even joined peasants in simpler meals on fast days, though of course their simple dishes often came with saffron or almond milk. The atmosphere shifts during fasts. Nobles set aside gold goblets, eat more quietly, and focus on prayer. Servants hurry through their meals, then shuffle to the chapel. The connection between food and faith is absolute. What you eat is an act of devotion. You wonder how many stomachs growled louder than hymns. Still, fasting brought unexpected variety. Without meat, cooks grew creative with legumes, peas, beans, and grains. Almond milk, a blend of ground almonds and water, became a common substitute for dairy, especially in wealthy households. It's nutty, surprisingly modern, and far less perishable than cow's milk. You sip some, nodding at the taste, and think, medieval vegans might have had more options than you'd guessed. You can't resist another joke. Picture a medieval knight bragging that he's plant-based during Lent. Not for health, not for ethics, just because the bishop said so. But behind the rules, the tension lingers. If food is scarce, fasting feels brutal. If storerooms are full, fasting feels symbolic. The church insisted on discipline, but the experience varied depending on your place at the table. For peasants, fasting might mean just skipping meat they couldn't afford anyway. For nobles, it meant reluctantly giving up venison while still sipping spiced almond milk. Same rule, different reality. As the bell tolls again, you finish your last bite of bread and follow the others toward the chapel. Your belly isn't full, but it isn't supposed to be. Tonight's meal wasn't about survival or luxury. It was about obedience, ritual, and the invisible calendar etched deeper than any hunger pang. The chapel doors close behind you, and by the time you wander back into the courtyard the next morning, the air hums with a different kind of energy. The castle may be surrounded by barren fields, but traces of faraway lands sneak through its gates in sacks and barrels. Imported foods, carried across seas and deserts, remind you that even in a frozen fortress, the world beyond never stops moving. You spot a merchant unloading crates from a mule-drawn cart, his cloak heavy with frost. Inside one crate, almonds, smooth and pale. Another reveals figs, shriveled but sweet. A third holds citrus fruits, their bright rinds glowing like captured suns. Mainstream fact, trade routes funneled luxuries into medieval Europe, bringing spices, sugar, almonds, and dried fruits from the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and even Asia. Castles that could afford them became nodes in this vast network, their kitchens flavored by worlds most of their inhabitants would never see. A cook pleas a lemon, the sharp zest cutting through the damp winter air. Nobles adored citrus, though it was rare enough to serve as both food and decoration. Quirky tidbit. There's evidence of oranges being gifted as Christmas presents in wealthy households, long before the tradition trickled down centuries later. Imagine receiving a single orange and treating it with the reverence you give to a new smartphone. But imports were never guaranteed. Historians still argue how reliably castles could access these luxuries during harsh winters. Some suggest steady flows via established trade networks. Others insist supply was sporadic, with nobles feasting on figs one year and cursing empty storerooms the next. War, weather, and politics all disrupted the flow. One bad storm in the Mediterranean, and your lemon pie dream turned into onion stew reality. You wander into the kitchen as almonds are ground into paste for sauce. Almonds were crucial, not just for flavor, but as a base for almond milk, a fasting substitute for dairy. Their versatility made them worth the expense, especially when church rules limited meat and milk. Combined with sugar, another costly import, they produced marzipan, molded into shapes of animals or castles, edible art reserved for the Lord's table. Picture biting into a candy sculpture shaped like the very tower you're sitting in. Meanwhile, servants hover nearby, watching these luxuries pass under their noses but rarely onto their plates. Imports were aristocratic currency, proof that your lord wasn't just surviving winter but thriving despite it. To pour cinnamon into wine or present candied almonds at a feast was to announce, "Our castle is connected to the world. We aren't trapped in snow. We command ships and markets far away." You grin at the absurdity of it. In a hall where soldiers chew black bread until their jaws ache, nobles show off dates from Palestine like party tricks. It's culinary theater, equal parts survival and spectacle. Yet there's no denying the joy these foods sparked. Imagine biting into a fig after weeks of salted pork, the sweetness bursting like a memory of summer. Imagine peeling a lemon when the world outside is white and gray. The scent alone a reminder that warmth exists somewhere. Imports weren't just food, they were hope, wrapped in rind and spice. Joke time. If you were a medieval merchant, you could probably walk into a castle, hold up a single bag of pepper and say, "This tiny pouch costs more than your moat." And you wouldn't be wrong. As the day ends, you see the noble's table glowing with bowls of spiced almonds, candied fruit, and a dish of marzipan shaped like a hunting hound. Down in the barracks, soldiers lick their lips and go back to their onions. The imports dazzle one half of the castle while bypassing the other entirely. But everyone smells them. Everyone knows they're there, and that alone shifts the mood. So you chew a crust of bread, sip your ale, and imagine the taste of lemon you'll probably never get. The imported foods may not reach you, but their presence in the castle reminds you that even in the bleakest winter, the world is wider than the snow pressing against the walls. You rub your arms for warmth as the fire in the great hall dwindles low, and the mood in the castle feels thinner than the gruel in your bowl. By now, the storerooms echo with emptiness. Barrels that once brimmed with salted pork hold only brine. The last smoked fish has been picked clean, its bones simmered into broth until even the marrow has given up. It is the heart of winter, and you begin to realize survival comes down to crumbs, crusts, and sheer stubbornness. Peasants gnaw the hard heels of bread, so tough they must soak them in ale before chewing. Nobles eye the dwindling supplies with irritation, feasts shrinking to modest meals. You laugh softly at the absurdity. Imagine being a knight who once bragged about roasted swan, now sulking over a thin onion stew. Mainstream fact: late winter was often called the hungry gap, the hardest stretch when old stores ran out, but spring growth hadn't yet returned. Castles with poor planning sometimes faced famine in February and March. To cope, people grew inventive. Bones already boiled once were boiled again. Ale that had gone sour was still drunk, though faces puckered with every sip. Servants swept up grain dust from the bottom of sacks to make flat cakes. Quirky tidbit: some castles even baked bread mixed with ground peas, beans, or acorns, stretching precious flour, but leaving bread with a strange, bitter bite. You can't help smirking. Today, someone would market it as gluten-free, artisanal woodland loaf and charge a fortune. Still, hunger sharpened tempers. Historians still argue whether castles truly rationed fairly in these lean times. Some evidence suggests lords reduced their own portions to keep soldiers loyal. Others point to chronicles of nobles hoarding the last luxuries while their servants starved. The truth probably depended on the lord's character and how nervous he was about revolt from within the walls. After all, a hungry guard might not guard you at all. Days pass in monotony, meals blurring into one another. Porridge, weak broth, dried peas, the faintest trace of pork fat spread on black bread. The thrill of spice, citrus, and marzipan feels like a dream you once had. The castle breathes slowly, holding its breath until spring. And then one morning, the thaw begins. Snow softens, dripping from the battlements. Servants rush outside to gather the first green shoots, nettles, leeks, sorrel. They're small, but after months of gray food, they taste like sunlight. You pluck a wild onion from the damp soil and chew it raw, eyes watering but heart soaring. This isn't just food. It's proof the world has turned again. The last crumbs of winter meals give way to the first gifts of spring. Chickens lay more eggs. Fresh milk returns to the pails. Gardens sprout tiny herbs, peas, and cabbages. The castle shakes off its hunger like a heavy cloak. You realize, as your belly finally fills with something fresh and green, that every winter meal wasn't just about surviving the cold. It was about believing in the thaw. Now the torches burn low, and your footsteps grow slower as you imagine leaving those stone halls behind. The hunger, the salted pork, the sour ale, they fade into whispers as the season softens. The castle, once a fortress of scarcity, begins to breathe again with the scent of spring herbs and the promise of full harvests. You let your shoulders loosen, knowing that in this story you survived the long winter. The rhythm of meals, lavish feasts, simple stews, endless fasts, and those rare sparks of imported wonders becomes distant, like a dream you once drifted through. Even the cold, damp walls of the cellar lose their bite when you remember the warmth of the hearth, the chatter in the hall, and the surprising creativity people found in the hardest times. Close your eyes and picture the final crust of bread, broken and shared. It's not a feast, but it's enough. Then, picture that first green shoot of spring, sharp and bright against the gray. Hope you can taste. The journey of winter eating in castles wasn't only about food. It was about patience, resilience, and faith that warmth would return. So let the crackle of your own room's quiet settle in around you now. Let the last echoes of ale mugs and clattering trenchers drift away. The walls of the castle fade, the cold fades, the hunger fades, and what lingers is the gentle comfort of survival. You are here, safe, warm, listening in the dark, and the story has done its work. Sleep well, dream of golden feasts and humble roots alike, and when you wake, may the day feel like spring breaking through frost,